I'm a guest joining me in studio, and we're going to be talking today about how people in medicine, for instance, respond to tragedies such as natural disasters like the one we've seen this morning taking place in Italy following an overnight earthquake there. And of course, we're not strangers to that type of thing here in the Northwest, and we're dealing with, of course, massive flooding down in Louisiana now as we speak. And people there still in the bullseye with perhaps even more on the way. Just a quick note. I wanted to pass this along in the first segment, forgot to do it, but for those of you who normally text me questions and observations during the show, my smartphone is sitting on an end table in my living room, so it's not available to me today, but that's okay because I have somebody interesting to talk to. That's Russell Singleton joining us from Tripp Family Medicine here in Twin Falls. And Russell, first of all, I'd like to say welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be back.
And we're talking a little bit about relief efforts because, from a medical perspective, first of all, in Italy, they're probably overwhelmed right now when it comes to hospitals and first responders and the like, and it's going to be that way perhaps for days, if not a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. I actually had a completely different topic prepared for today, but went to bed last night with news of a tumbler, and then I woke up this morning, and so far the death toll is up to 63. It ended up being a 6.2 magnitude earthquake I guess, in the center of Italy. And the death toll is only expected to rise. And I just couldn't help but think this is what we needed to talk about today because these things seem to be more and more common. And you mentioned what's going on in Louisiana. I think there's probably at least 13 dead in Louisiana. And fortunately, I think I think floodwaters are starting to go down, but now we're left with how do we clean up? How do we help people? Of course, those in Italy are just beginning their journey. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about what's going on there, how we can help them, but then how we can help ourselves, how we can be prepared, both from a medical and a practical perspective.
One of my former television acquaintances, I was actually listening to her today, Amy Kellogg, as she was driving into the scene and trying to describe how you have this beautiful setting and yet everything there is just so devastated. And so people are going to be overwhelmed not only as a non-medical professional, but from a medical professional standpoint too. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of sleep. You've got to deal with all of the tragedy around you too as well. It's a stressful situation, and I know that probably people who have to deal with mass casualties have to sometimes just stand back and take a deep breath for a moment.
Yeah, so true. I know one of the first things I was taught when dealing with an emergency situation, now not a mass casualty situation. I admittedly was not trained for that, and there are people that do specifically receive that training. But in reference to what you said, one of the first things I remember hearing from an instructor was stop, take a deep breath, and take your own pulse and slow down and think critically because you do start to rush and you start to make rash decisions and something else you said, Bill, I think is really important. In these situations, the number of victims always outnumbers the number of helpers, of first responders. And so if anything, today I hope to maybe impart a few tips and a few suggestions to help uh, each and every one of us become one of those first responders because you're absolutely right. Medical personnel are overwhelmed, and they're probably not going to be in a situation where they have the tools of their trade, the things that they're not, or the things that they're used to using. And so it's a completely new situation for them as well.
And we wanted to point out too, I mean, just simple things. If you don't have anybody nearby who can work on you, and a lot of these initial wounds you have, and for instance, an earthquake, are going to involve cuts, broken bones, compound fractures, things like that. There are some treatments I guess people could start working on their own before medical arrives because simply you want to try to prevent infection and shock and some other things.
Absolutely. The first 72 hours after a disaster are the most important, especially when we're talking about an earthquake situation like we see in Italy, where there's a lot of debris. The town of Amatrice, for example, small little village of 2,000, almost completely leveled, according to their mayor. And the 63 people we know of so far doesn't count, of course, those that are still buried in the rubble. And 72 hours is about as long as someone can survive, because at that point you start uh, missing food and water, obviously, but your air supply, and then like you mentioned, the injuries that you sustain are without receiving medical attention are going to become more and more critical. So um, controlling bleeding, I think, is one of the first things that we should do. Absolutely. In medicine, we talk about the ABCs of trauma, and ABC stands for airway, breathing, circulation. Now, not necessarily in that order, but one of the first things you can do is address C, circulation.
Hold that thought, and we'll pick this up with the ABCs in just a moment. We want to mention Russell Singleton is joining us in studio, physician assistant from Tripp Family Medicine here in Twin Falls. He's talking about response to disasters, natural disasters, or other types of tragedies that happen around the world, similar to what we're seeing in Italy this morning. We've got more on that coming up in just a few minutes. News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Russell Singleton is our guest. He's joining us from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. In fact, located on Fillmore Street. That's on the north end of the city. And you would see the office directly across from the main post office. You can see the sign there in the windows as well. And sometimes there's even a larger sign out front. We should point that out.
Absolutely, and it's to let people know that we are still accepting new patients, even though our practice is growing tremendously well. We are trying to grow with it. We don't ever want to be at the point where you can't get in and see someone for 2 or 3 weeks, which is oftentimes the norm.
And of course, Tripp Family Medicine is on Facebook. That's with two P's in the name Tripp. And what's the telephone number at the office?
933 4400.
You were talking a little bit about the ABCs, and when you have we don't necessarily see a lot of devastation from earthquakes in southern Idaho. We feel them, but you never know. And when you see what's going on right now in Italy, you were mentioning the ABCs, and the first thing you were mentioning was stopping bleeding. If you don't have any medical pros around, you got to do certain things on your own.
Yeah, and I should probably take one step back, Bill, because the first thing you need to do as a responder or as a witness is to make sure that it's even safe for you to get involved. Because the last thing we need is to add one more person to the victim list. So in a situation like an earthquake, you need to be very aware of what the debris situation is like. Is it safe for you to enter a building or to even uh, climb on top of this loose debris? Are there water hazards, downed power lines, gas lines? Um, what if you're a witness of a traffic accident? Your first response might be to pull over to the side and jump out of the car, but unless you're looking around you, that might not be the best thing to do. But back to the ABCs, I think C, standing for circulation or bleeding, blood flow, is probably one of the first things a layperson can look at. If there's any open wounds, put pressure on it and keep adding gauze or clothing or whatever you have to stop that bleeding. One thing I would recommend you don't do is remove any old, soiled um, dressings to replace them with new ones. What you're actually going to do is to tear away some of the natural clotting factors. So add to it. Even if you get a stack of gauze a mile high, just keep adding to it, never take away.
And sometimes when you mention that, if you were to pull one of these things away, the bleeding starts all over again. If it's a big enough wound, you're right back to square one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think a layperson is really able to assess airway or breathing. But one thing you can do is just make sure that the person's head is tilted back and the chin is lifted. We do want to be aware of any neck injuries, but at the same time, if your options are to be quadriplegic or to die of suffocation, I think you probably want to secure that airway. But then the next thing is to try and stabilize any major wounds. Like if it's apparent that there is a cervical injury or a neck injury, you can try and stabilize that. If there's someone else with you, have them hold that head as stable as you can, so there's no movement. Any movement in that neck can further damage nerves, and if not create permanent disability. It can certainly worsen it. But then try and stabilize any other wounds. If there are fractures, if you've got bones sticking out, I wouldn't suggest that the layperson try and reduce them by pulling or pushing or anything like that, but just find something rigid, find a board or um, some cloth or clothing, and try and keep that joint or that bone from moving any further, while at the same time putting pressure on the wound.
Going to be dealing with a lot of crushing wounds as well. That's the one thing. These people were asleep when this happened in Italy, and obviously they're dealing with that, and so there's got to be some things you've got to be concerned about too as well.
Absolutely. During a crushing type injury, the risk for internal bleeding is pretty high. And if a person is bleeding internally, you're going to see their abdomen swell and become discolored. If the bleeding is in the chest, you're going to see breathing become labored. So it's not always a hard and fast rule, but elevating the legs is a great option because if there is a wound, whether it's internal or external, blood is going to flow towards that wound and away from vital organs. And luckily, in most people, the vital organs are all pretty much in the same area, the head and chest, and you want to include or you want to improve blood flow to that area. So by raising the legs, gravity helps redistribute that blood back to those vital organs and keep you alive. Even though it may mean you lose a leg, again, you're alive.
We have a telephone caller with us, and Russell, if you want to grab the headset, we want to mention to the callers that the telephone number 736-0300, Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. And caller, you're on the air at 849.
Well, good morning. You
Good
guys
morning.
have hit a topic that's very near and dear to me. Uh, I'm a former firefighter as well as law enforcement, and I'm also an outdoor enthusiast. And I can't stress enough how much it can help in a natural disaster situation or even an ATV accident out in the woods that the average person go take a basic first aid class, because it's these very simple things that you're talking about this morning that can save a life. Or also, on the flip side of that coin, if you have no first aid training and you think you're going to help a person by removing an impaled object, or like Russell just talked about, removed uh, blood clotted clothing or fabric, and make a wound worse or open up the blood flow again. It's a very important thing. We have natural disasters, car accidents, things like that all the time.
I think that we should also note too that when he mentioned that, I had a training course when I was a college student 30 some years ago, and I thank him for the call. I have not had an update. The only thing I remember is treating a sucking chest wound, and that in itself probably would. I'd be so frightened, my hands would be shaking.
Yeah,
But if you need to be updated periodically in these things.
absolutely. The first thing I would want to say in response to that call would be to thank that caller for his service as a firefighter, as a member of law enforcement. I can't thank enough those men and women that put their lives on the line and for such poor pay and lifestyle. I just respect so much those public servants in our military, and I'm just so grateful, especially in light of some of the political uh, problems facing our law enforcement. I'm so grateful for those folks, and luckily I haven't been pulled over in a while, but I've I've just felt that the next time I'm pulled over, I just want to, I'll take the ticket, but I just want to thank that officer for what he does. So caller, thank you for that. But I could not agree more. And that was actually one thing I wanted to say specifically. Go out and find either a first aid course or a CPR course. In healthcare, we have to repeat that every couple of years because yes, it does change. I mean, we talked about the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. Well, it wasn't too long ago that that's now CAB, circulation, airway, breathing, because the priority of things has been reevaluated and reassessed. Um, the number of compressions versus breaths when you're doing CPR is constantly changing, from 15 to 2 or 30 to 2. So go out there and do it and keep it current. Don't rely on knowledge that you have 10, 15, 20 years ago because yeah, it does change.
And we do want to thank you for the call and telephone number if we have another voice out there that would like to chime in today. 736-0300. That's 736-0300. Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine today on KLIX. Coming up on 8:53, Russell Singleton, a physician assistant from Tripp Family Medicine, is our guest. And you're on the air.
Yes, I was wondering if there appears to be nothing wrong with the chest and the breathing or the airway is a problem. Is hands only CPR still a viable option?
We got a little interference there, but I think I got that.
Yeah, I couldn't hear the whole question, but I think the crux of the question is hands only CPR. Is that still an option? And there was also something about wounds in there, and so you have to take that into account. If you're doing CPR on someone and you see blood squirting, out somewhere else, then you need to take care of that first. You need to stop bleeding before you attempt CPR. But to answer the question at its most basic level, yes, hands only CPR, compression only CPR is absolutely acceptable. Please don't ever be afraid to lay hands on someone, especially if you've been trained, and do CPR. If you're kind of queasy about giving a breath to someone, whether or not you have one of these rescue masks that you probably should have in a first aid kit, give compressions. Absolutely give compressions, and don't stop giving compressions until someone is there to relieve you.
Want to thank you for the call. As I'm watching some of the coverage this morning, before I left the house even this morning, and I was listening to the discussion of how difficult it is to get into this village in Italy where the worst damage seems to be, you realize there are going to be some people there, you hate to say it, but who are going to need amputations. And if you don't have medical professionals in the area quickly, how do people deal with that issue?
Wow, that is a great question, Bill. I don't know that I have a good answer for that. Wow. I think we should talk a little bit about triage, maybe in a disaster situation, because obviously people are going to have different types of injuries. Their chance of survival is going to be different. Generally, as a medical professional, and again, I have not been specifically trained in disaster medicine, but we want to try and identify those people who have not the greatest wounds, but the greatest chance of survival. And so we will oftentimes do a very quick assessment called an initial survey or an initial assessment to see what the patient's chances are of survival. And a person who obviously needs an amputation, um, they might rank pretty low on that triage list because there's nothing that I can probably do in the field. Maybe if I had lived during the Civil War and had some training as a what are they a sawbones or whatever they called those old field surgeons, it'd be a little bit different. But wow, what a difficult thing. And that brings up another point too. We haven't really talked about mental trauma and anguish and the shock that people are in. And this kind of ties it all together. But what do you do for someone who has a medical condition that you can't treat? Or maybe they're stuck in an area that you can't get to. Maybe you move on to the next person who has a greater chance of survival, but you could also stay there and hold a hand, give them some comfort. I'm not suggesting you lie to them, but give them some hope. Let them know that help is on the way, that you're going to stay there with them, and I think that would be tremendously helpful.
Because you were going to have people who could be, and I think back to that story in San Francisco about the fellow who was caught between the two highways, and it took them a long time. He eventually passed away, but they managed to save him, keep him alive, and talk to him, keep him conscious and alive, at least during the rescue effort, and that at least kept him away from the thoughts about, I'm gonna die here in this spot, away from everyone and alone.
Yeah, the older I get and the longer I'm in medicine, the more I realize that we're all going to die sometime. And no one has yet made it out of this life alive. And if I can just make people a little bit more comfortable, and in medicine, that doesn't even really mean curing their disease. It doesn't mean necessarily getting their blood sugar right where I want it. It means improving their quality of life and giving them some dignity. And I think the same applies during a disaster situation.
And that's the thing too, is you're going to find so many cases here where You just sometimes, I think, have to pray with someone in a
Yeah,
situation like this.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. In our last couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about.
And we're down to about 30 seconds.
Are we really?
Yeah.
Holy cow! So, ladies and gentlemen, take some steps right now to get prepared. Sit down and think what you would do, what you would need if a situation hit home. Do you have a storage of food and water? If you've got kids and pets, do you have formula and diapers and pet food? Are you stocked up on your medications? Is your health where it should be? Are you financially fit, or are you under mountains of debt and digging deeper? Do you have all your documents where they need to be? Your birth certificate, your passport. Do you have a first aid kit? I wish we had time to talk about what should be in that first aid kit, but make sure you have one. Do you have a 72-hour kit, a go bag, if you will? Make a plan. Start now.
I should point out that I keep all of my documents in a Charles Chip can. So, but I know where they are.
You'll have to explain to me later what Charles Chip is.
Dating myself on that one. Want to thank Russell Singleton for coming by, joining us this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Hey, quickly, what's the telephone number at the office for people who'd like to reach you there?
933-4400. Any one of our lovely receptionists or nurses will pick up and probably get you in the same day.
News is next.